You call that swimming? My pet rock could do better, and it sinks straight to the bottom. Captain Lin shouted through her underwater microphone, watching the strange creatures struggle in the ocean currents. The massive submarine-like vessel sat at the ocean floor, bent and damaged from what must have been the worst underwater entry in history. The Navy had been watching carefully for weeks since unknown objects were detected in Earth's orbit. There were many theories: secret military tests, unusual sea creatures, or even sunken satellites. But the truth was much stranger and funnier. Far across the galaxy, the visitors from a warm water planet had created what they thought was a perfect plan. Earth was filled with oceans, a paradise of liquid resources. The water pressure would be a mild 1 atmosphere at the surface, nothing they couldn't handle. Or so they believed. Their ship had plunged through Earth's icy Arctic waters like a stone, despite the crew's desperate attempts to control their descent. Their heat shields had failed the moment they hit the freezing temperatures, and what followed was a series of increasingly panicked efforts to slow their fall to the ocean floor. As the bubbles cleared, Lin shook her head. "Looks like the cold had other ideas for them," she muttered, looking at the group of divers around her. "All right, team, let's go see what kind of tropical visitors came to check out our frozen seas." They approached carefully, oxygen tanks ready, but not exactly worried. The whole situation already felt like a comedy they were about to become part of. The vessel's outer shell was cracked and dented, showing marks from its violent descent. With a burst of escaping air, a section of the ship split open, creating a jagged doorway that released bubbles into the water. From the dark opening, several shadowy figures emerged. Captain Lin blinked, then laughed into her microphone. "They're wearing heating suits." The visitors, tall with 4 arms, struggled forward awkwardly in bright orange thermal suits designed to maintain their body temperature and help them deal with Earth's freezing oceans. The suits glowed with heat, creating small currents of warmer water around them as they moved, clearly showing they had completely underestimated just how cold things could get down here. "Welcome to Earth," Lin shouted, waving a hand in mock greeting. "How are you enjoying our refreshing water?" The lead visitor, wobbling precariously in the current, turned its bulbous head toward the captain. Its voice, translated through a device strapped to what appeared to be its neck, came out as a gurgling sound. "We demand your immediate surrender," it bubbled, clearly struggling to stay in place as the ocean current pushed against it. Behind it, the others drifted in their suits, fighting a losing battle against the Arctic water's natural movement. "Right," Lin replied dryly. "Let's see how that works out for you." Diver Rodriguez, floating beside Lin, couldn't stop a laugh from escaping. "They can barely hold position, Captain. I think our cold water is freezing their plans." "That's what happens when you skip cold training," another diver quipped, causing ripples of laughter among the team. The visitors, however, were completely serious. One raised what looked like a weapon, a long cylinder that immediately began to glow with heat at its tip. It might have been threatening if it hadn't been shaking in the visitor's trembling arms as it fought to maintain position in the current. "Take cover," Lin ordered, but her voice carried more amusement than concern. She watched as the visitor struggled, then finally lost its battle with the cold water. Its limbs seized up, and with a burst of bubbles, it drifted backward, the weapon floating away harmlessly. The scene dissolved into chaos, but not the dangerous kind the visitors had planned. As more tried to move forward, their joints stiffened and their movements became sluggish in the freezing water. One by one, they drifted helplessly, arms waving uselessly as the cold seeped through their inadequate heating suits. "Looks like we've got ourselves an invasion of popsicles learning to swim," Rodriguez remarked, struggling to contain his laughter. The lead visitor, now drifting upside down in the current, burbled incoherently before managing to right itself. "You humans cheat," it gurgled. "Your planet is cursed with this frozen liquid." Lin stifled a laugh and swam closer, hovering in front of the visitor leader. "Not cursed, friend, just a bit colder than you expected," she said, tapping the visitor's bright orange suit with her diving knife. "You really should have checked the temperature before dropping by uninvited." The visitor, now barely moving its 4 arms, stared at the captain. "You will not prevail. We will adjust." "Adjust, huh?" Lin said, swimming upright. "Well, while you're busy adjusting, we'll be here not freezing our tails off." She turned to her team. "All right, folks, let's round them up gently. They're having a rough day." The divers moved in, surrounding the defeated visitors who, despite their best efforts, couldn't seem to control their movements in the cold water. The sight was almost pitiful, these supposed conquerors unable to even stay upright in the current. Some tried to activate their weapons only for their fingers to become too stiff to press the controls. "Think they've got reinforcements coming?" Rodriguez asked as they herded the visitors into a makeshift holding area created with portable barriers. Lynn scratched her chin thoughtfully through her mask. "If they do, they'll probably end up the same way. I mean, look at them." She gestured to the visitors now floating in a dejected group, bumping into each other. "Cold water is our best defense. You can't invade a planet when you're too busy trying not to freeze." The lead visitor finally managed to stabilize itself, though it shivered visibly inside its suit. "We underestimated," it admitted through chattering mouthparts. "No kidding," Lynn replied, crossing her arms. "You see, it's not just the cold here. It's the pressure, the currents, the sea creatures. Everything in these oceans is built to withstand extreme conditions. And you brought heating pads to an Ice Age fight." The visitor leader stared but remained silent, its large eyes narrowing in a mixture of frustration and resignation. The others seemed equally discouraged, their plans of invasion literally frozen by the one force they couldn't prepare for, Earth's relentless cold. Rodriguez swam over to Lynn, speaking quietly. "So what now? Do we call this in?" "Not yet," Lynn replied, smirking. "Let's see if they have a backup plan. I'm curious how they'll handle, say, swimming to the surface." The divers chuckled, casting glances at the distant shimmer of light far above them. If the visitors thought entering was difficult, navigating Earth's freezing, current-filled ocean would be the real challenge. The visitors huddled together in a dejected group, occasionally looking up toward the distant surface as if hoping for a miracle to warm the water around them. Captain Lynn swam back and forth, keeping her eyes fixed on their unexpected guests. She could almost see their minds working as they processed their situation. These visitors weren't giving up, they were regrouping, thinking, and that concerned her. "Captain," Rodriguez approached, holding a digital tablet in his waterproof case. "Our sensors did a quick scan of their vessel. It looks like their ship is still somewhat functional, but they're not going anywhere soon. Engines are frozen solid and their entry cracked their hull in multiple places." "Good. Keep watching them," Lynn replied, not taking her eyes off the visitors. "They're planning something. I can sense it." As if on cue, the lead visitor finally moved, awkwardly shifting its body to face the humans. The glow of its heating suit intensified as it diverted more power to stay warm. Despite the extra heat, it still trembled visibly, fighting the cold that penetrated its protection. "We have not surrendered," it gurgled through the translator. The other visitors perked up, a ripple of movement passing through their ranks. Despite their initial defeat, a determination still burned within them, one that even the Arctic cold couldn't completely extinguish. Lynn raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "All right, tough guy. What's next? Another clumsy attempt to take over our planet while you can barely keep from drifting away." The visitor's eyes narrowed, and it pointed one of its 4 arms toward the distant surface where light filtered weakly through the water. "There," it said, its voice warbling slightly. "Test conditions. We will adapt." The captain smirked. "You sure about that? Swimming up there is challenging even for us, and we're used to this environment." "We will prevail," the visitor insisted, though it trembled in its bright orange suit. A few of its companions seemed ready to protest, but they fell silent under its determined gaze. "Suit yourselves," Lynn replied with a shrug. "We'll be right behind you in case you need a helping hand, or a tow rope." The visitors formed an unsteady line, their movements slow and difficult as they prepared to swim upward. The humans followed, maintaining a safe distance but staying close enough to intervene if things went wrong. Lynn had to admit she was curious about how far the visitors would go to prove themselves. "Place your bets," Lynn muttered to Rodriguez as they swam. "How long before they give up?" Rodriguez chuckled, bubbles escaping his mask. "I'm giving them 10 minutes tops. The thermocline layer is just above us, and the temperature drops another 5 degrees. They can barely handle this depth." The ascent began with a gentle upward swim, nothing too difficult for the humans who navigated the water with practiced ease. But for the visitors, it was a different story. Their heating suits strained against the cold, glowing brighter as they tried to compensate. Still, they pressed on, their leader at the front struggling upward in what could only be described as a mix of stubbornness and pride. "Why do they even bother?" Diver Patel whispered through the comms, shaking his head. "You'd think they'd call it quits after their crash landing." "They're trying to save face," Lin replied. "If they retreat now, they'll go back home in disgrace. Their society probably values persistence or some principle like that. It's like they'd rather fail spectacularly than admit defeat." The water grew colder as they ascended, and the visitors' progress slowed. One of them seized up, its limbs stiffening as the temperature dropped. It began to sink, unable to keep swimming. Lin watched, half expecting the rest to abandon their fallen comrade, but to her surprise, two others stopped to help, their heating suits glowing brighter as they shared warmth. "Well, I'll be," Rodriguez remarked. "Looks like they've got some team spirit." "Or they're desperate," Lin said, though she couldn't hide a hint of admiration. "Either way, they're not giving up. Makes you wonder how they even thought invading Earth's oceans was a good idea in the first place." The lead visitor paused, turning to glance back at Lin. "You think us foolish," it bubbled, clearly struggling to keep its body functioning in the increasingly cold water. "But we learn, adapt, evolve." Lin crossed her arms, maintaining her distance. "Learn all you want, but Earth doesn't play fair. You're not dealing with just us humans. You're up against everything this planet throws at you. The cold is just the beginning." The visitor nodded, or at least attempted to. Its movements were sluggish, and it looked close to shutting down, yet it resumed its upward journey, pushing through the water with rhythmic movements of all four arms. Behind it, the others followed, their progress slow but steady. "They're actually doing it," Patel murmured in disbelief. "They're not fast, but they're still moving." Lin felt a twinge of respect, though she'd never admit it out loud. "We'll see how long they last," she muttered, but inside she knew the visitors had a point. They were adapting, little by little, to Earth's punishing environment. The swim continued, and the minutes ticked by, 10, then 15, then 20. Rodriguez had already lost his bet, and now the humans were watching in silent admiration as the visitors continued their ascent. Their suits glowed fiercely against the cold, and their movements were labored, but they didn't stop. Finally, the lead visitor reached a slightly warmer current, pausing to drift there as its body trembled from the exertion. Slowly, it turned its head, locking eyes with Lin through her diving mask. "We can endure," it managed to say, its voice weak but filled with a glimmer of resolve. Lin swam closer, hovering near the exhausted visitor. "All right," she said, crossing her arms. "You made it this far. But let me ask you something. What's your end game here? Even if you adapt, what makes you think you can take over a whole planet like this?" The visitor didn't respond immediately. It took several moments to recover, its heating suit pulsing with energy. "Not take over," it finally gurgled. "Survive. Coexist. Learn your strength and find ours." Lin blinked, taken aback. She had expected bravado, defiance, maybe another threat. But this was different. She exchanged a glance with Rodriguez, who looked equally surprised. "Coexist, huh?" Lin muttered, her tone skeptical but curious. "So you're saying this invasion was just a test run?" The visitor drifted slightly in the current, its body clearly exhausted. "Adapt or perish," it whispered. "Your world unforgiving, but we will adapt." Lin swam closer, looking the visitor directly in its large eyes. "We'll see about that," she said. "For now, rest up. You're going to need it for what's coming next." The visitors floated scattered through the water, their heating suits dimming as they desperately tried to recover from the grueling swim. Captain Lin hovered a short distance away, watching them intently. She could sense the tension in her team as they observed the alien visitors in their exhausted state. There was a strange kind of respect growing among the humans, though none of them dared to voice it. "What's our next move, Captain?" Rodriguez asked quietly, his eyes still fixed on the visitor leader who now drifted listlessly, barely conscious. Lin considered the question. These visitors weren't what she had expected. They had started this operation intending to conquer Earth's oceans, but now, beaten down by its relentless cold, they spoke of coexistence. But talk was cheap, Actions would reveal their true intentions. "We'll push them further," Lynn said finally, her eyes narrowing as she considered their surroundings. "If they want to adapt, we'll give them the full Earth experience. Let's see if they've got the determination to handle the next test." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind, Captain?" Lynn pointed to a distant underwater cave system where strong currents flowed between jagged rocks. "They'll need to navigate through those caves, deal with the currents, and find their way to the open water on the other side. It's treacherous, narrow passages, swirling water, and even colder temperatures. If they're serious about this coexistence idea, they'll find a way to manage it." The dive team exchanged uncertain glances, but there was an underlying excitement in their eyes. Lynn's plan wasn't just to break the visitors, it was to truly test their resolve. If they could endure this, maybe there was a chance for something other than conflict. Lynn approached the visitor leader, who managed to orient itself as she came near. "All right, here's the deal," Lynn said, hovering in front of its face. "You want to learn, adapt, coexist? Fine, but you need to prove it. Through those caves, against those currents, and out to the open water. No shortcuts. If you can do that, then maybe we can talk about something other than you freezing solid here." The visitor leader struggled to maintain its position, its heating suit flickering as it diverted power to its critical systems. "We accept," it gurgled, though its eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. Behind it, the other visitors drifted nervously, glancing at the dark cave entrance with apprehension. "Good," Lynn nodded, swimming back. "Your move." The visitors formed an unsteady group at the cave entrance, looking into the dark, swirling water with visible concern. With a faint glow, their heating suits intensified, preparing for the even colder temperatures ahead. Slowly, they began to enter the cave system, moving with extreme caution. Lynn and her team followed at a distance, keeping a close eye on their visitors. The caves were treacherous, filled with narrow passages and unpredictable currents that pushed and pulled from all directions. It wasn't long before the first visitor was caught in a surge, its body swept against a rock wall. It tumbled through the water, its heating suit flickering as it tried to recover. The others paused, looking back at their struggling companion, but the leader motioned for them to continue. "Keep moving," it bubbled, its voice strained but commanding. With a burst from its suit, the fallen visitor righted itself and rejoined the group, clearly damaged but not defeated. "They're really giving it their all," Rodriguez muttered, unable to hide his surprise. "Didn't think they'd make it this far." "They're stubborn, I'll give them that," Lynn replied, though her voice was less harsh than before. She couldn't deny that their persistence was impressive. They were pushing their limits, adapting bit by bit to the harsh realities of Earth's oceans. The visitors reached a particularly narrow section where the current rushed between jagged rocks, creating a natural barrier. They paused, clearly assessing the situation. Then, to the human surprise, they linked their 4 arms together, forming a chain to help each other navigate the dangerous passage. The leader went first, fighting against the current, its heating suit glowing bright orange in the dark water. It struggled through, then held position, anchoring itself to help pull the next visitor through. One by one, they made it past the barrier, working together in a display of coordination that impressed even the skeptical human divers. Hours passed as the team followed them silently, Lynn's expression unreadable behind her mask. The cave system grew more complex, the current stronger, the temperature even lower. The visitors were visibly suffering, their suits struggling to maintain heat, but they didn't stop. At last, a faint light appeared ahead, the exit to open water. The visitors paused at the final passage, gathering what strength they had left. The leader turned to its team, communicating something the humans couldn't hear. Then, with a synchronized movement, they swam forward together, breaking through the final current and emerging into the open ocean beyond. "Well, looks like they made it," Rodriguez remarked, checking his oxygen levels. "But can they handle the open water?" The visitor leader hovered in place, looking back at its exhausted team. Together, it signaled, and they formed a tight circle, their heating suits glowing as they shared warmth. For a moment, it seemed they might drift apart, the ocean currents pulling at their weakened bodies. But they maintained formation, working as one unit to stay together. Lynn watched, arms crossed, as they stabilized themselves in the open water, adapting their swimming techniques to the changing conditions. They had done it. They had endured Earth's challenges one exhausting stroke at a time. The captain approached, hovering near the leader who drifted, clearly exhausted but still functioning. "All right," Lynn said, her voice softer than before. "You've proven your point. You're not just here to take, you're here to learn. That's a start." The visitor turned its large eyes toward her, gleaming with both exhaustion and something else, hope. "We wish to coexist," it managed to say, its voice barely audible through the translator. Lynn nodded, extending a hand to the visitor. "Then let's start fresh. We'll figure this out together. But remember, the ocean's always going to be cold for you here. You'll have to keep adapting every day." The visitor hesitated for a moment before reaching out with one of its 4 arms, grasping Lynn's hand with surprising strength. "We will," it promised. As Lynn guided it toward the surface, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of camaraderie. They had a long journey ahead, but for now, Earth's oceans had given these visitors a harsh lesson in humility, and it was one they seemed willing to learn from.